The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson. I fled him. Down the nights and down the days I fled him, down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind. And in the mist of tears I hid from him, and under running laughter. Up vistate hopes I sped, and shut precipitated adown titanic glooms of chasmid fears, from those strong feet that followed after. But with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy they beat. And a voice beat, more instant than the feet, all things betray thee, who betrayest me. I pleaded, outlaw-wise, by many a hearted casement, curtained red, trellised with intertwining charities, for though I knew his love who followed, yet was I sore adread, lest, having him, I must have naught beside. But if one little casement parted wide, the gust of his approach would clash it to. Fear wist not to evade, as love wist to pursue. Across the margent of the world I fled, and troubled the gold gateways of the stars, smiting for shelter on their clanged bars, fretted to dulcet jars and silvern chatter the pale ports of the moon. I said to dawn, be sudden, and to eve, be soon. With thy young skiey blossoms heap me over from this tremendous lover. Float thy vague veil about me, lest he see. I tempted all his servitors, but to find my own betrayal in their constancy, in faith to him, their fickleness to me, their traitorous trueness in their loyal deceit. To all swift things for swiftness did I sue, clung to the whistling mane of every wind, but whether they swept smoothly fleet the long savannas of the blue, or whether thunder-driven they clanged his chariot thwart a heaven, plashy with flying lightnings round the spurn of their feet, fear wist not to evade, as love wist to pursue. Still with unhurrying chase and unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy, came on the following feet, and a voice above their beat, naught shelters thee, who wilt not shelter me. I sought no more that after which I strayed in face of man or maid, but still within the little children's eyes seemed something that replies, they at least are for me, surely for me. I turned me to them very wistfully, but just as their young eyes grew sudden fair with dawning answers there, their angel plucked them from me by the hair. Come then, ye other children, natures, share with me, said I, your delicate fellowship. Come, let me greet you lip to lip, let me twine with you caresses, wantoning with our Lady Mother's vagrant tresses, banqueting with her in her wind-walled palace, underneath her azure dais, quaffing as your taintless ways from a chalice, lucent weeping out of the dayspring. So it was done. I in their delicate fellowship was one, drew the bolt of nature's secrecies. I knew how the clouds arise, spumed of the wild sea snortings. All that's born and dies rose and drooped with, made them shapers of mine own mood, or wailful, or divine. With them joyed and was bereaven. I was heavy with even when she lit her glimmering tapers round the day's dead sanctities. I laughed in the morning's eyes. I triumphed, and I saddened with all weather. Heaven and I wept together, and its sweet tears were salt with mortal mine. Against the throb of its red sunset heart I laid my own to beat, and share commingling heat. But not by that was eased my human smart. In vain my tears were wet on heaven's grey cheek, for we know not what each other says, these things have eyes. In sound I speak, their sound is but their stir, they speak by silences. Nature, poor stepdame, cannot slake my drouth. Let her, if she would owe me, drop yon blue bosom veil of sky, and show me the breasts of her tenderness. Never did any milk of hers once bless my thirsting mouth. Nigh and nigh draws the chase, with unperturbed pace, deliberate speed, majestic instancy. And past those noised feet a voice comes yet more fleet. Naught contents thee, who content'st not me. Naked I wait thy love's uplifted stroke. My harness, piece by piece, thou hast hewn from me, and smitten me to my knee. I am defenseless utterly. I slept, methinks, and woke, and slowly gazing, find me stripped in sleep. In the rash lustihood of my young powers, I shook the pillaring hours, and pulled my life upon me. Grimed with smears, I stand amid the dust of the mounded years. My mangled youth lies dead beneath the heap. My days have crackled and gone up in smoke, have puffed and burst as sun starts on a stream. Yea, faileth now even dream the dreamer, and lute the lutenist. Even the linked fantasies in whose blossomy twist I swung the earth a trinket at my wrist are failing. Chords of all too weak account for earth, with heavy grief so o'erplussed. Ah, is thy love indeed a weed, albeit an amaranthine weed, suffering no flowers except its own to mount? Ah, must, designer infinite, must thou char the wood ere thou canst limn with it? My freshness spent its wavering shower in the dust, and now my heart is as a broken fount, wherein tear-drippings stagnate, spilt down ever from the dank thoughts that shiver upon the sighful branches of my mind. Such is what is to be. The pulp so bitter, how must taste the rind? I dimly guess what time in mist confounds, yet ever and anon a trumpet sounds from the hid battlements of eternity. Those shaken mists of space unsettle, then round the half-glimpsed turrets slowly wash again. Yet not ere him who summoneth I first have seen, and wound in glooming robes purpureal, cypress-crowned. His name I know, and what his trumpet saith. Whether man's heart or life it be which yields thee harvest, must thy harvest fields be dunged by rotten death. Now of that long pursuit comes on at length the bruit, that voices round me like a bursting sea. And is thy earth so marred, shattered and shard on shard? Lo, all things fly thee, for thou fliest me. Strange, piteous, futile thing, wherefore should any set thee love apart, seeing none but I make much of naught, he said. And human love needs human meriting. How hast thou merited of all men's clotted clay the dingiest clot? Alack, thou knowest not how little worthy of any love thou art. Whom wilt thou find to love, ignoble these, save me, save only me? All which I took from thee I did but take, not for thy harms, but just that thou might seek it in my arms. All which thy child's mistake fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Arise, clasp my hand, and come. Halts by me that footfall. Is my gloom, after all, shade of his hand outstretched caressingly? Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee when thou dravest me. That was The Hound of Heaven by Francis Thompson, late 19th century Catholic poet and mystic. As we get into the third season of Strenuous Conversations, I want to start working on some economic and political Catholic social teaching type stuff. So I'm currently rereading Hilaire Belloc's The Servile State and getting ready to write my show notes for it. But in the meantime, I thought I'd take a change of pace and just go back and do this poem, which is one of my favorites, one of the I think greatest Catholic and mystic poems of the English language. We'll talk as I go through the workout today, which is posted below. I'll talk about Francis Thompson's life, which is fairly interesting and impinges upon his poetry and the understanding of it. And then over the next couple of episodes, we'll talk briefly about the poem itself and kind of dig deeper into its meaning. So let me get this timer started over here. All right, grab my show notes. So, Francis Thompson, born December 1859, Lancashire, England. His father was a convert to the Catholic faith from Anglicanism. He was also a doctor, by all accounts a fairly hardworking and well-respected country doctor. At this point in England, Catholics are definitely a minority. They're still, I believe, forbidden by law from holding public office in certain offices. This is, I think, so the most famous of the converts of this period would probably be Cardinal Newman, who converted in 1845, so 14 years before Thompson was born. But, what this means is that somebody who converts to Catholicism in this period is pretty serious about it. Because they're going against the prevailing culture of their time, which is Anglican. Now, so Francis Thompson lives at home until he's 11 years old. Then he goes to Ushaw College, which is a Catholic boarding school. While at Ushaw College, from the age of 11 on, Ushaw, he was remembered for being very good at literature and not much else. He took most of the prizes for composition during his time there. And by most, I mean like 95 or better percent of them. So clearly talented with writing and with literature. The rest of his studies were either not very remarkable or straight up horrible. His classmates remembered him as being the last boy ready for physical exercise every single day. He liked to spend large amounts of time in the library. He was dreamy, kind of daydreaming all the time, abstracted, not really focused on what was going on around him. Lived in his own head a lot. He seemed to be interested in cricket, but only as a spectator, not as a player. Which I think he actually later wrote some poetry about cricket. So he definitely enjoyed it, but didn't himself play it. He did well enough at school to graduate, at any rate. But upon graduation, the teachers and his headmasters failed to recommend him to continue on with studies for the priesthood. I read a quote from his father addressing this. His father addressed this, saying that he was forced regretfully to agree with the priests and the teachers that it did not appear to be the will of God that Francis should be called to the holy priesthood. The fact that he just had absolutely no practical capability to pay attention was probably significant in that. At any rate, so his father encouraged him to study medicine instead. And we don't know how strongly or forcefully he encouraged that, but it's quite apparent that Thompson had absolutely no intention of ever becoming a doctor. But didn't seem able to tell his father this. Instead, he went to medical school. At this time, his parents had moved, so he was close enough to spend nights with them while he was at school. He spent 6 years at medical school and took the same examination and failed it 3 times before his dad got the message. So after failing out of medical school, he was 24 at the time, his father said, "All right, get a job. Any job, anywhere, just get a job." So, just a dutiful son that he was, he went out and he tried to get a job. Made a couple of attempts. They all failed. Didn't amount to anything. At this time, he was also apparently in very poor health. And it's somewhere in this time of his life that he becomes addicted to opium. And there's some different sources. The introduction to the Lost Books edition, who's the author of the introduction I have not been able to ascertain, states that he was given the book Confessions of an Opium Eater, and this seemed like such a cool book to him that he decided to try laudanum. The Wikipedia article and several of the other online sources, including, I think, Encyclopedia Britannica, they state that he was given laudanum for either nervous conditions or tuberculosis. Regardless, at this point he became addicted to opium. And for someone who was already unable to hold down a job, this pretty much put the nail in the coffin of him ever being useful. So he begged from his father the price of the train ticket to London. His father agreed, gave him the money for a train ticket, and also set up an allowance for him to be collected weekly from a family friend who lived in London. I hate this computer. So, in his mid-20s, Francis Thompson disappears into the underbelly of London, and after the first few weeks, stops even calling and trying to pick up his allowance. I don't think he ever explained adequately why he disappeared and didn't pick up the allowance, whether he was just trying to just vanish himself so that he wasn't a disappointment to his dad anymore, or just forgot about his allowance. But he spent the next several years anyways living on the streets. He was a homeless druggy bum, doing menial work, blacking boots, holding horses while people went into the stores, whatever he could do to earn a coin here and there. He used to spend a lot of time at the libraries until one day he was told by the constables, "Don't come back here, you're too ragged and dirty." From this point on, he had access to only 2 books, his copies of Blake and Aeschylus, which he kept in his coat pockets, and contemplated suicide. Was sick. His health was never good, but he's probably suffering from tuberculosis at this point. Lost a lot of weight, almost died. At the lowest of the low, he was found by a prostitute who took him into her home, nursed him back to health. She subsequently disappeared from his life. He never revealed her name, but in his poetry, he referred to her as his savior because she saved his life at this point. One other chance encounter
set the stage for him to begin the pull out of this hole that he was in. An Anglican lay missionary who owned a boot store came across him in the street and was intrigued by the contrast between the way he was speaking and his appearance. So he eventually prevailed upon him to accept a job at the boot store, and this gave him a few months of respite. A few months of respite. It didn't work. It didn't end up working because he was, well, I mean, let's face it, he was never a practical man. And now, being an addict, he had the added disadvantage of needing his fix regularly. So he failed at selling boots. And his benefactor was forced to fire him. But the few months of not living on the streets was apparently enough for him to get some time and some space to write some poetry. Shortly after this came the turning point in his career. He sent some of his poems to a Catholic literary magazine called Merry England. The editors were a married couple, Wilfred and Alice Meynell. And Mr. Meynell received the poems. It was several months from the sending to his reception because the manuscript was so battered and dirty and disgusting that it was put on the bottom of a stack. They thought it was just waste paper. It was very fortunate that it wasn't thrown in the wastebasket. But as soon as he read them, he immediately recognized the talent that was behind them. So he tried to get in contact using the post office address that he was given. This didn't work because Thompson did not call to receive his mail. The proprietor of the post office said he hadn't seen him in months. Still determined to get a hold of him, Meynell publishes one of the poems and hopes that the author will recognize it and get in touch with him. He did. So Thompson gets in touch with him, says You can reach me at a bookstore, but then forgot to call and pick up his mail at the bookstore. Undeterred, Mano goes and basically stakes out the bookstore and eventually discovers how he can get a message to Francis Thompson and says, "Please come and meet me at my office. I want to talk about your poetry." Well, Thompson shows up months later. He was wrestling back and forth in his head. It's like, no, they can't actually want to see me. He was ashamed of his appearance. He was ashamed of what he'd been doing. Mano's son describes their first meeting. The door of the office opened and a hand comes in and then goes out. A few minutes later, a hand comes in to open the door and then goes away. And then a third time, a hand comes in to open the door and then goes away. But eventually, he screws up his courage. He opens the door, he walks into the office, and the meeting is made. To make a long story short, Wilfred and Alice essentially adopt Thompson. They take him into their home, and then they were concerned about his opium habit and his overall health. So they sent him to Our Lady of England Priory, run by Franciscan friars, essentially for rehab. He spends several years there before his eventual recovery. And once again, we have some conflicting sources. Some saying that he did not use opiates from this point on until his final illness. Others saying that he continued to use opiates, but only as prescribed, to use modern terminology. From this point on, Francis Thompson maintains his friendship with the Maynolds, even being godfather to one of their children. And he continues to write poetry from 1888 until about 1889. His poetry was given a very mixed reception in the literary criticism of the day. Some triumphantly proclaiming that it would be studied 200 years from now, when most of the rest of the more popular poetry was forgotten. Others claiming that it was basically just trash, or that it was interesting but would never be popular. All of that, of course, is beside the point, because here it is 150 years later and we're still reciting it. Now, in 1889, or thereabouts, he kind of quit poetry and turned his attention to prose. No one really knows why this is. It may be because of the critical reception of his poetry, even though he had a fairly extensive literary circle they were his friends and they were laudatory of his poems. Another theory for why he stopped writing poetry at this point is that his health was just not good and he didn't have the energy for it. However, he continued to write prose, became a well-known, well-respected literary critic. He wrote several essays, A Life of St. Ignatius, and he kept himself busy until very near the end. Towards the early years of the 20th century, his health began to decline pretty drastically. He'd had tuberculosis since he was a boy. The years of living on the streets and of addiction had taken their toll. And he died in November of 1907, about 1 month shy from his 48th birthday. At the time, he weighed only 70 pounds, which gives you an idea of how poor his health was. And that is a brief synopsis of the life of Francis Thompson. Next week, we'll get into discussing the poem itself. We'll probably go in by sections, and we'll just kind of chit-chat about it. I'm not a literature major by any means, but I do enjoy the poem and have read it probably hundreds of times, if not thousands, over the last few years. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time.